Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer O'Neill, and our topics today are criminal justice and youth advocacy. We're pleased to have Patrick Keenan-Devlin, Executive Director of the James B. Moran Center for Youth Advocacy, and a League member, I might add, as our speaker today. We're especially interested in the Moran Center's work because the League of Women Voters of Illinois is developing a new position on criminal justice. Our league will participate in the consensus process, so we're eager to understand some of the work that's being done in our community. The new position is particularly concerned with issues of incarceration, pretrial services, and relations between the community and the police. The work of the Moran Center touches on these and other issues with particular focus on youth and the criminal justice system. So Patrick Keenan-Devlin was named Executive Director in July of 2016. In addition to ensuring the effective implementation of the Moran Center's strategic vision, he continues to represent youth in juvenile delinquency proceedings and serves as a nationally certified trainer in juvenile defense practices. Previously, Patrick served as the Deputy Director and Staff Attorney of the Moran Center, and before that, he worked as the Health Policy Advocate for the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, and as Legislative Director of Citizen Action, Illinois. He's also held numerous leadership roles in various local civic and community organizations. He's a Northwestern graduate with a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Music, and he received his law degree from Loyola University, Chicago School of Law. So, one side note before Patrick starts, and that is, if you have questions along the way, if you put them in the chat room, we'll try to get to those a little later on. So, Patrick, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So you do very important work, and I think it might be best to start with your making us more familiar with the Moran Center. Give us a little background and talk about the services that you provide.
Happy to. Thanks, Jennifer. So before I do that, let me just say thank you again to the League of Women Voters for this opportunity today to talk about the Moran Center and the important work that we do in our community. I am a League member, as Jennifer mentioned. I've been a League member since I was 18 years old. The League played an incredible role, actually, in me feeling welcomed in our community. Two women that I think of quite often in the work that I do is Sue Brady and Martha Rudy, two incredible League members who taught me so much about organizing and value-based advocacy. So it's always an honor to speak to the League and to be in community with all of you. So let me tell you a little bit about the Moran Center. So the Moran Center was founded in 1972 as the Evanston Defender Project. And I think it's really important to always talk about the history of the organization because I think it tells you a lot about who we are and what our roots are. So in October of 1970, there was a young man named John Cox. He was 19 years old. Who woke up in the middle of the night and checked on his 2-year-old son, who was unresponsive in his bed. He performed CPR and was unable to resuscitate his child. He calls for law enforcement. Law enforcement made the gut response that he murdered his child, arrested him, held him in custody for 72 hours without access to legal counsel or access to his family. He attempted suicide in his jail cell. Evanston police then transported him in a comatose state to Evanston Hospital. Evanston Hospital then lied to his family and said, "You can't afford our medical care, so we're recommending that we transfer John to Cook County Hospital." The family, out of fear for bankruptcy, agreed to the transfer. And so John was transferred to Cook County Hospital, and Cook County Hospital then had a gurney waiting for him to take him out the back door to the county jail hospital. After 3 transfers, John died. And Alderman James B. Moran, the third ward alderman at the time, was outraged at what happened in our community and commissioned a study with Northwestern University to investigate Evanston Hospital, Cook County Hospital, Evanston Police Department, the Cook County Public Defender's Office, the Circuit Court of Cook County. And ultimately, when the report was published to the City Council found $25,000 in the city budget to start the Evanston Defender Project, which was a project focused on providing community-based defense services for low-income youth and young adults in our community. It was ultimately incorporated in 1981. And then when Judge Moran passed away in 2009, in 2010, we renamed the agency in his honor. And I tell that story to ground us in our history and in John's tragedy, which is always close to my heart, remembering him and his young son, Sydney. But it's also to ground you in what our core focus is at the Moran Center, which is juvenile and criminal defense for children and young adults up to age 26. And I know Jennifer's going to ask me why age 26 later on. But that's really the core of what we do. And everything else that we do harkens back, stems back to that core work. So about 10 years ago, we started an expungement and sealing help desk at the Skokie Courthouse because we recognized that as criminal defense attorneys and juvenile defenders, we had been part of the problem of shackling so many of our clients with criminal records that were barriers to employment, to housing, to loans. And so as part of our penance, we started an expungement help desk at the Skokie Courthouse to help residents clear their records and restart their lives. We then focused, also starting about 10 years ago, on prevention. How do we keep people and families, children, young adults out of this broken system altogether? And we started a school, an education advocacy program that focuses on representing children in special education and school discipline matters. So we represent children who have disabilities, who need greater access to supports and services. We represent children in expulsion and suspension proceedings in order to stem the school to prison pipeline, because we want children to be included in school as opposed to excluded. If you hear my alarm going off, that is my reminder that my child needs to start her e-learning talking about school. The other piece of our prevention work then moved again in April 2018. We launched a school-based civil legal clinic in partnership with District 65, which is incredibly brave. And I always want to say that on the part of District 65, in that we are often adversarial to the school district. And yet the school district welcomed us into their school cafeterias, into their principal suites, into their school libraries as lawyers to help families stem and address the civil legal issues that were destabilizing families and thereby destabilizing children's ability to be in school and be successful in school. So we run that clinic now in partnership with District 65, representing families in bread and butter civil legal aid matters like evictions, public benefit denials, unemployment benefit denials. Again, trying to stem another pipeline to institutionalization, the poverty to prison or the poverty to institutionalization pipeline. As we in our nation have criminalized poverty, we believe that this clinic plays a critical role in our community in stemming that tide. And then the last piece of the Moran Center that I just wanted to talk about momentarily is our restorative work, which I know Jennifer also will be asking me about a little bit later. But it is this idea that legal aid and legal and social workers that we partner with within the Moran Center are only ever band-aids to issues. And if we really want to systematically address systems of oppression in our community, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us. And the tool that we believe is the most critical tool in achieving that end is restorative justice. And we are on a mission at the Moran Center to embed restorative practices in our schools, in our businesses, in our government, because we believe that is actually how you dismantle these destructive pipelines, that we've been in those pipelines trying to keep people out, or if people are in the pipeline, trying zealously to mitigate damage. But how can we actually upend systems completely and create restoration for our children and our families? And that's the new work and really critical work of the Moran Center going forward.
Thank you. We've had one request that you lean a little bit closer to your computer to be heard a little bit easier. I think you're also brighter when you're closer to your computer. So I wonder if you would talk a little bit about who your clients are, maybe some demographics, and how do you find them and how do they find you?
Yeah, so the Moran Center's model shifts based upon the program that we're speaking of. So our juvenile practice is fairly easy for us to connect with clients in that there is one court call, which is out of the Skokie Courthouse, where children from Evanston are referred for juvenile prosecution. And so it's an easy way for us to catch children and to interface with children and families and to educate them about what the Moran Center does and how we can be helpful. In terms of emerging adults, so young people 18 and over, there are at least 8 courtrooms in the Skokie Courthouse alone, let alone the myriad of courtrooms all across Cook County that young adults could enter into. And we have no way of being physically present in all of those courtrooms at one time. So we are far more reliant in our criminal practice for family members and young adults to reach out to us directly. In terms of our education advocacy program, we are in our early childhood centers, educating early childhood providers. We are continually on the circuit in our community, educating parents about their educational rights. We're in partnership with organizations like Evanston Case, which is a local nonprofit that supports parents and families with children with disabilities. And so we have a robust education program about our educational services and educational advocacy services. And so that's how we connect with families in that regard. And then our school-based civil legal clinic, we are physically housed in schools. And so that's how families access our civil legal services. But then I also would be, I wouldn't be doing justice to District 65 in that their school social workers are our #1 referral source for our school-based civil legal clinic. They contact us often on their cell phones in parking lots, as they're at front doorsteps of families' homes in our community, trying to connect the families and children that they serve to our civil legal services. And so I'm really thankful for their partnership, in particular, our school social workers in District 65. In terms of our demographics, 87% of our clients are male and 15% are female. In terms of racial demographics, 73% are African American, 19% are white, and the remainder are Latinx. 100% of our families are 80% or below the median income level in our community. And then the average age of our client is approximately about 16, 17 years old.
Okay. And yes, I do want to ask you about the age again. So we understand that you expanded the age from a top age of 22 up to 26. In light of conclusions reached by scientists that brains aren't fully developed until 25, and the suggestion that youth shouldn't be treated as adults in the courts until 26. So this is an issue identified by the League Study Group, And we'd like to know what your experience tells you and whether you do think that this is a change that should be recognized by the criminal justice system.
Well, going back quickly to our founding story. So from 1972 on, the Moran Center has always served young adults in the criminal courts. And I really honestly believe that we have always served young adults in the criminal division because Alderman Moran, then Judge Moran, had 18-plus-year-old children in his family. And I think he saw as a father the lack of maturity of his 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old children. And so I really think it came down to that. I think it was Alderman Moran, Judge Moran, seeing his own children and recognizing their immaturity at those ages and not seeing some magic happening on a person's 18th birthday, that all of a sudden you magically become an adult and should suffer adult consequences on your 18th birthday, because he was a father. And so we've always served young adults. From our outset, we only served young adults up to the age of 22. But yes, Jennifer, we did raise the age of our services to 26, and that's to comport with new neurobiological and developmental psychological research that has come out that has said that your cognitive skills, your emotional intelligence is really developing up until your mid-20s. And so because of that, we shifted our model and now represent young people up to the age of 26. You know, I would also say that you don't really have to look much further than private industry to see also why science is catching up to what the private industry, what the private sector has been doing for decades, which is that you know, if you are under the age of 25, you pay the highest insurance premiums on auto insurance. So the auto industry knows something that the courts have not caught on to for decades, that, you know, 18 to 25-year-olds are riskier. They take greater risks on the road, and so they have higher insurance premiums. There is also precedent in our laws that we have a minimum drinking age in the state of Illinois of 21. And I think lawmakers were informed by the riskier behavior that 18 to 21-year-olds engage in, and so had a higher threshold of a minimum drinking age in our state. I think that there are many ways that our society has recognized that the 18 to 25-year-old population is still a population that is maturing and should be treated differently. The Moran Center has been an advocate in the state legislature for raising the age of the Juvenile Court Act. I would love to see it personally go from 18 to 26, but to take baby steps, we've supported legislation actually by our very own state senator to raise the age of the Juvenile Court Act from 18 to 21 for misdemeanors. And I think that is a good first step for right-sizing our adult criminal system and bringing many men, women into our juvenile court jurisdiction. Now, I have heard from opponents that, oh my God, you know, the sky would fall down. We don't have the capacity to address 18 to 21-year-olds who've been convicted of misdemeanors in our juvenile courts. Well, that same argument was made when we raised the age of the juvenile court jurisdiction from 17 to 18, first for misdemeanors and then for felonies. We've actually seen a drastic reduction since we raised the age in the Juvenile Court Act to 18 in terms of the overall numbers of children being prosecuted in our juvenile courts in Illinois. So I think our juvenile courts are, first, they have the capacity, and I think they have the skill set necessary to support 18 to 21-year-olds. So that would be my recommendation to the league as you continue to study this question is could our juvenile court system be a better venue for this age demographic?
Thank you. Your website says that you serve youth both in the courtroom and the classroom, and you talked a little about that. And we know that one of your goals is to stem the school to prison pipeline. So I guess we'd like to know a little bit more about what kinds of problems your students have and how you work both in the classroom and the courtroom to resolve some of those problems and, you know, alternatives to suspensions at the school, that sort of thing.
Sure. So we started our education advocacy program in 2010. And we did that because so many of the young people that we saw in juvenile court had been suspended from school, had been expelled from school, or they weren't being able to access the classroom because they had a disability and they were falling behind. And so we started an education advocacy program to create greater equity within our educational systems, our local educational systems. And we started that venture targeting the young people that we were representing in juvenile court, because the linkage was just so clear that school failure was driving children into the juvenile justice system. And so to play our role as attorneys, we started this education practice to stem that tide and to stem the school to prison pipeline. With that said, I'm actually really proud to report that the Moran Center has really expanded our education advocacy program to focus more so on prevention. And it happened quite organically. And what I mean by that is, you know, Mrs. Smith, when we represented her 17-year-old child in securing better educational services from the high school, 3 years later calls and says, you know, I have an 8-year-old who I'm fairly certain has some autistic tendencies, but the district is saying that they're unwilling to test at this point. Can you help me? And so it just very organically shifted. And of course, we still represent young people that we see in our juvenile courts in educational proceedings, but the average age of our education advocacy practice has really gone down because we're representing so many more 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 11-year-olds in getting the educational supports and services that are due to them under the law. And I think that's exactly what we should be doing, is trying to get those services in place earlier. I can't tell you how many times I've been in an IEP meeting, an individualized education program meeting, where you can literally see the pipeline shatter because supports and services have been put into place. And educational advocacy is a powerful tool in our toolbox as community lawyers to stem that school to prison pipeline. The other role that we've played in educational space is we have partnered with the high school in developing alternatives to suspension. So in 2011, we rolled out the first ever alternative suspension program at the high school called VIP. And I'm really proud to say that it was so successful in saving suspension days. So children, when they would successfully participate in this program, would not have to serve their suspension days. And throughout the course of the program, would get those days returned to them. And so would stay thereby in the classroom learning. We were so successful in that program that Evanston Township High School said, we want to take this over. And that's exactly what should happen. Because the district saw the advantage of having an alternative suspension program and valuing it so much that they invested their own resources, their own staff into that. And so as a result, since 2011, we've seen a decline in the number of suspensions at the high school. Now, what we have also seen, and ETHS is not unique in this, whenever systems reforms are attempted within any system, whether you're talking about healthcare, whether you're talking about education, whether you're talking about the criminal justice system, when you have seen a decline in fill in the blank, unfortunately, disparities have increased. And so that has persisted And I know that we have a partner in the high school in addressing those ongoing racial disparities. And so one thing that we are working on presently with our partners at the high school is working on embedding restorative practices within school discipline at the high school. And to give you just a quick definition, or at least Patrick Keenan-Devlin's definition of restorative practices and restorative justice, it is not foo-foo. You ever hear anybody say, oh, restorative practices, that's just, liberal, hippie, dippy, it's not, especially if it's done well. It is about accountability. In order for restorative practices to be effective, the offender has to be held accountable and has to repair the harm. But it is not about what did you do or how can we punish you for what you did. It's about how can you repair the harm? What do you need to repair the harm? And what do you need to be repaired? And those questions are asked of the offender and the victim equally. And of the community too. In order for restorative justice to work, community has to be engaged in the dialogue. And I'm really proud of leaders at Evanston Township High School for embracing restorative practices and working with us in figuring out how to train staff, train students, maybe even more importantly, in restorative practices, because they are the community, right? They are the community within our schools, how they can be trained and potentially even facilitate without us stupid adults getting in the way, because that would be the ideal, right? That it is us as community, wherever that community is, resolving our own conflicts and resolving our own harm that we have caused or that has been caused to us, or that has been thrust upon us. I've been talking so long now, Jennifer, I don't even remember the question. Hopefully I answered it.
Well, the good news is you began to answer the next one, because I want to get more into restorative justice. And I guess if you could take it a step further for some of us who aren't as familiar, what's the process? How does that work?
So restorative justice, I have a very similar philosophy, actually, probably in regards to everything and anything in my own life, in my professional work. Everything has to be individualized in order for it to be truly effective. A child's education needs to be individualized. I think you talk to any great educator, they're going to tell you the same thing. I differentiated between the 20 kids that were sitting in front of me because I knew they had distinct needs. And I think that's true when we are talking about adopting restorative practices within systems. It can never look the same in any one institution or any one system or any one community, because in order for restorative justice to work, community has to be at the table in the development of it. So what restorative justice looks like in Dawes Elementary School could look very different than what it looks like in Lincoln Elementary School. It could even look different in Mrs. Jones's first grade classroom than it does in Mr. Finch's fifth grade classroom. I mean, it really has to be community driven, community focused, and at its core, what it is, and I answered this, and I already said this, but I'll say it again, because maybe I'll say it better the second time around, which is just that restorative justice is about holding the person who caused harm accountable, bringing the victim into dialogue with that offender, asking both parties what they need to repair harm and what they need to be repaired themselves. And the community has to be part of that dialogue, because community is always harmed when any harm has occurred, right? Now, restorative justice, I think, also has a more broad application. I also think it can teach us how we just communicate with each other, how we radically listen to each other. We don't need to adopt restorative practices only when a harm has been caused. In my family, we've adopted restorative practices where we do take turns in listening to each other. I mean, that's what it is at its core, is allowing one person to finish their thought uninterrupted, and not sitting on the edge of your seat ready with your response. To really be in intentional relationship and radically listen to the person sitting next to you, and then responding intentionally yourself. And what power, what power that would give us as a community in being in better relationship with each other, because that's really what it's about. But how amazing would it be when a harm has occurred if we're already in relationship with each other? If we've already practiced these tools when a harm hasn't occurred, how much better we would be as a community, and probably how much swifter we would achieve resolution if we were already in better relationship with one another and had practiced radical listening. So that's what it is at its core. Now, I'm anticipating that, given this is the league, and the league never has an event without studying something extensively, the league probably has already come across in its research and studying the North Lawndale Restorative Justice Community Court, which is an example of how a system adopts restorative practices and restorative justice, and attempts to use that tool to deflect people away from the brokenness of the criminal justice system. So that court started in August 2017, and the Moran Center is a close partner with Lawndale Christian Legal Center, which was the driving force behind the court. And we've been watching that court with watchful eye since 2017. And I think they know that we're all watching the court, because so much hope is bound up in that pilot project. And I really do believe that it can be a beacon of hope for not just our community and state and region, but the nation. And I would really love to see a restorative justice community court here in Evanston or Skokie, Rogers Park, our little portion of Cook County. And to give you a sense as to what the North Lawndale Restorative Justice Community Court is engaged in, so it is a court that is focused on resolving conflict involving 18 to 26-year-olds who are the offenders, who live in North Lawndale. It is primarily being used for drug offenses at this point as part of its pilot, where the community is really the only party that has been harmed. So victims are not really, how do I phrase that? It is a restorative justice court where the community is almost consistently the victim in the case, as opposed to an individual victim. And I know for a fact that the vision for that court is that the drug offenses which launch the court and are the primary makeup of the offenses that make up its docket, that it is expanded upon. And that we do have more complex cases referred by the state's attorney's office to the North Lawndale Restorative Justice Community Court. And when we will do it, adopt a similar model here in our region of the county, I really would like to see us adopt a model that included really victim-based offenses, because I know that we have the capacity to tackle those more complex, raw, emotionally raw cases, and use this tool as a means to deflect people away from the criminal justice system, and also, really importantly, give victims a voice. I know that the league observes our courts and knows that victims are shunted in the courtroom and our silence in the courtroom. And restorative justice not only gives victims a voice, but gives them a process by which they can inform how harm is repaired. And I think it's a really revolutionary model. And I want to see this model come to Evanston, come to our region of Cook County. And Moran Center is actively engaged in accomplishing just that.
That's a very strong statement. Thank you. I guess one quick follow-up question that I saw in the chat room is there clear evidence that restorative practices in the schools has led to fewer cases, fewer offenses?
I think that what the high school can point to is alternative suspension programming has absolutely led to a reduction in suspensions. And my hope is that once adopted, and they're in the process of doing this, adopting more of a restorative lens throughout their discipline infrastructure, that we'll see those numbers go down even more and really tackle disparate impact, because that's something that really needs to be addressed as well.
Okay, need to take a sip of water? Yes, because the next question, we'd like to talk about the racial and ethnic bias and policing. And, clearly we've seen demonstrations and protests for racial justice, and we've seen demands for defunding the police. How has the Moran Center engaged in this process, and what are you seeing so far?
Yeah, so I have been, and the Moran Center has been, incredibly inspired by our young people. The Evanston Fight for Black Lives movement in Evanston is a youth-led movement. So adults, get out of the way. They are focused on upending systems, reforming systems, reimagining systems. And I would be lying to you if I said that the Moran Center had not been changed by their activism. And seeing their activism on the streets, but also being deeply impacted by the violence that we have all witnessed on the news to Black and brown bodies in our nation, and seeing the impact that has had on our clients that we serve, and giving voice to that. We have been more laser focused than ever on creating an advocacy agenda that puts our clients in the driver's seat and that gives voice to their experiences within systems, and using this opportunity to create reforms and what I hope will be real lasting reforms that will build a more peaceful, equitable, and just community. And just to touch on a few of those, we have called for an end to the school resource officer programs in both of our school districts. And we have submitted testimony to both school boards advocating that what needs to happen is we need to focus we need to rethink whose safety are we truly prioritizing in placing police officers, armed police officers, in such close proximity to our students in an educational setting. We've also advocated for alternative models to policing and have championed Alderman Fleming's move to create an alternative emergency response subcommittee within the Human Services Committee to really use that forum as an opportunity to experiment with best practices across this country, because I think we can all recognize that police should not be responding to many, many, many calls to 911. And we are doing far more harm by relying upon law enforcement to be mental health responders. And we are actively working to dismantle the notion, the incredible myth that social workers, mental health professionals are these shrinking violets that can't address real danger and that can't de-escalate real moments of tension. Many social workers, mental health providers, clinicians go into their profession because that is what motivates them. And I know on this call we have many mental health practitioners and that could attest to that and that could debunk that myth that we need armed police officers to respond to every moment of crisis. We don't. And I'm really looking forward to the report that is that comes out of that committee. And Kristen Kennard, our deputy director, is serving on that committee. And I know we'll use her voice to champion and to amplify the experiences of our clients, the young people that we serve. And then I already talked about really digging deep in advocating for restorative policies and practices all across our city, in government, in businesses, in our schools. That has really, our efforts have really amped up in that regard. And so those are just a few of the ways that we have been inspired by this moment in history and really don't want to let this crisis pass us by. And this national crisis calls for urgent responses, and hopefully our advocacy will result in, again, upending systems that have oppressed Black and brown people for far too long in this country.
Related to this, in 2017, the Moran Center formed Project Bridge
Yes.
to link teenagers with the Evanston Police Department in social and community building activities and that sort of thing. So has this program been successful, and how has it evolved now that we have all these more recent incidences and activities?
It's a good question, and it's a complicated answer. So the Moran Center approached the Evanston Police Department actually far before 2017 to bring our clients into relationship with police officers, particularly police officers that had perpetrated harm to our kids. And that program didn't work out. I'm going to be very transparent. It did not work out. And that's because it was the Moran Center approaching the police department. Now, Project Bridge is a different story. The police officers, many of whom had gone through a master's in jurisprudence at Loyola Law in child law, so inspired by that program, approached us and said, we really want to be in better dialogue with the young people that you serve. And we said, where have you been? We were so excited that they approached us. And so we started these restorative sessions and dialogues and activities with law enforcement. And you could see very evident from those sessions that kids' hearts and minds had been changed, and that officers' hearts and minds had been changed. Kids walked away from that program going, oh my God, did you hear that guy's feedback? He's actually a dad. I mean, kids couldn't even wrap their mind around the fact that these officers were humans, that they were fathers, that they were mothers, that they were grandmothers, that they were neighbors. I mean, it was just these basic aha moments that kids had. And officers, same thing, saw these kids as caretakers of their elderly aunts, as homework helpers for their younger siblings. I mean, it really changed minds and changed perspectives. Now, with the violence that our kids have seen, that we've all witnessed in our own community, certainly regionally, statewide, nationally, our kids have pulled back from wanting to be physically proximate to law enforcement. And we have to respect that. And we have to respect the anxiety that children, particularly Black and brown children that we represent, feel in being physically proximate to police officers. And so we are in the process right now of reimagining our own system and reimagining our own project in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, and how we can be better partners to our children and the young people that we serve and represent, but also be good community partners with law enforcement, and helping law enforcement be better and do better and serve better, because we believe that's part of our role as a community defense organization that interfaces probably more often than any other system in our community with law enforcement. Is we want to see a local police department that is truly responsive to our community's needs, and that is in relationship and dialogue with all members of our community, including the young people that we serve.
One of our audience would like to know what changes you've actually seen in terms of the way your clients are treated by police officers. Has there been any change recently?
So I think that, relationship is about individuals. And so, yes, Project Bridge has changed hearts and minds, both sides, kids and police officers. And I know that I can think of one example which a kid relayed to me, that he was hanging out with his friends downtown. One officer approached the kid and actually really started giving the kid a hard time. And this other officer, who had actually gotten to know this kid and a couple of his friends through Project Bridge, walked up and said, "Hey man, back off." And now who knows what would have transpired if that officer didn't intervene. But we know what did happen, what actually happened when he did, which was, the situation de-escalated. Everybody went about their own business. And so I know that moments like that happened because of relationships that were formed in Project Bridge. But how do we replicate that within systems? Right, and that is, and maybe I've done an injustice to this in previous comments, but I mean, that is the tension with restorative justice. And I know I've said this now several times, is it's about relationships. Systems are not about relationships. And yet, in order for systems to really be transformed, they have to be in relationship with community. And how do systems do that? And that is, talk about hurts your mind to just think about. But I think that's the work that we all need to be engaged in. And I think it's doable. I think it is very possible. But it is certainly challenging work to think about how we build systems that are really in relationship with community. And that community is first and foremost part of the development of those systems and infrastructures, because that's how we can ensure accountability and responsiveness to community and community need.
What else do you want us to know about the Moran Center?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that question. So I wrote down a couple things that I want you to know about the Moran Center. First off, I couldn't find a place, and I think it's only because of my poor organizational skills, to talk about a new initiative that Moran Center has been engaged in with the city of Evanston over the past year or so. So Mayor Tisdall, one of her last acts as mayor was to form the Alternative to Arrest Committee. And I'm very proud that Mayor Tisdall appointed me to be a member of that committee. And the charge that she gave the committee was figure out how we can have fewer arrests in Evanston. Figure it out. And one of the main tacks or strategies that we've taken, and it's kind of an odd tact, but is codifying misdemeanors from the state statute into the city code. Adding another tool in a police officer's toolbox, so as when they come across an offense, the automatic response does not have to be an arrest. It can be a citation where we can, as a community, address that harm caused in City Hall, as opposed to in the Circuit Court of Cook County, where you are shackled also with court costs and an arrest record and a court record. Now, we've expanded that vision for children, where we have said children are going to be funneled into a separate, private, confidential hearing and system within City Hall, where fines are really not the priority. And what is the priority is restoration. And so I'll give you an example of how this works. Prior to many of the reforms that the Alternative Arrest Committee advocated for, a child would have picked up a retail theft, may have been arrested, likely would have been arrested, had an arrest record. That child also could have been referred to court and then had a court record. We've now codified in the city code retail theft. So that kid who previously would have been arrested, the officer now has the option to cite the child. The child is then referred to City Hall as opposed to the Circuit Court of Cook County. The child is, all of their due process rights are afforded to them, but if they ultimately are found liable or plead liable, they're given the option of fine or restorative practices. Most children, almost all, opt for restorative practices. They then meet a city clinician who works with them in developing a repair of harm agreement to make amends for what happened. And then once they've satisfied that repair of harm agreement, case is dismissed. And we really believe that this could be a model for how we demonstrate our capacity as a community to take on more complex issues like North Lawndale. And it also gives us an opportunity to figure out how can we, within a system, develop relationships that support young people. And so backing up for a second, as part of a repair of harm agreement, almost innately, the child is going to need adult service providers to step in and support that child. And so can we create a hub of nonprofits and social service providers that really work in coordination with each other to meet the child's needs? And that's a critical part of creating systems that are really in relationship with each other and that support young people and support better outcomes for young people. So I did want to talk briefly about that new system. And then the other thing that I always want people to walk away with when they hear me talk, or really anybody from the Moran Center talk about our work, is our core value. And it is a core value that has been articulated by my hero, Brian Stevenson, who says that no one should be defined by the worst act that they've committed. And that is the guiding principle of the Moran Center. No one should be defined by their worst act, particularly children. But at the Moran Center, we believe no one should be defined by their worst act. And that community is really critical in holding institutions accountable to that principle. We as community members have to demand that that is the standard of justice, that nobody is defined by the worst act that they've ever committed. So that's another takeaway, Jennifer, that I want people to have in learning more about the Moran Centers. That's our guiding principle.
Wonderful. I don't see any other questions. Are there any? Betty, did you want to, based on the consensus questions and the study, did you have anything in addition that you wanted to ask about? You're muted.
I think there's so much interesting and positive information that we've heard. But I'm thinking about this vision of a community, well, with a network of restorative justice institutions. And in Evanston, I mean, what would that be and where would that be? And you talked about a network of agencies that could help to put this together. To what extent is this a network of agencies? To what extent is it um, would it be city staff, and to what extent would the police be involved? Because in some of these discussions, I mean, people say it's important that the police be part of this, not that they're excluded, because you want the police to understand the process and to, you know, to be a constructive part of it.
Totally. Well, I'll say, I if you saw my eyes darting to the side of the screen, I just was checking out the chat too, just because I was curious. And I really appreciated something Nina Raskin said, which is, in order for restorative justice to be, you know, effective, it's got to be all of us. Because it is a really revolutionary way to approach dialogue and harm reduction and harm mitigation. And so, yes, I think that the social service sector in our community has to be trained in restorative practices, has to understand it, has to treat their own staff restoratively. That is true at the city. It's true in the police department. It's true in our churches and synagogues. I mean, if we are to really be a restorative community, which I believe is integral to us being an equitable city, which our city council has said that is our objective as a community. It's both and. It's both and. Equity and restoration go hand in hand. And I would actually argue you can't do one without the other.
May I speak?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the reason why I made that comment was many of us have been parts of organizations and individuals who have worked on the concept of the welcoming community. And I think that is really important, that each of us as individuals, how we respond is important, but also in terms of our groups. And many of the people in the league have been in, for instance, open communities. And we had a set of principles. And part of that was to be welcoming, both as individuals and also to work with other groups to change attitudes. And I do think that, I mean, I'm really happy that you've spoken so much about the role of the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Helen.
I had sent a question to you, I guess, just to the host. And I think, Patrick, you've probably partially answered it, but I'm interested in hearing a bit more specifically from you. What changes have you seen in law enforcement? And I think you did address that partially in Evanston with the recent, in the last 6 to 8 months. And what further changes do you need to see happening for, and this is in connection with the unfortunate term defund the police, I think has done us more harm than good in terms of how we all feel about what you term restorative justice, which is a much better term. But if you were the chief of police, what would you be doing now?
So I actually have, Chief Cook and I actually have a really great working relationship. And I use that word very intentionally, relationship, because after our first meeting, I said, Chief, I hope that you and I can be in relationship with each other. And he laughed so hard when I said that to him, because I'm sure he's like, who is this guy? But I think we have been in relationship with each other and have open channels of dialogue. We don't always agree, right? We don't always agree. But I have really appreciated the chief's willingness to push ahead with codifying more misdemeanors in the city code and adding more tools to his officers' toolbox to keep people away from not even just the criminal justice system, from even just being arrested, which is transformational. That he's made statements in these past 6 to 8 months that he doesn't want children in the police station. I think that that's an incredible statement that you don't hear from chiefs of police often, if ever. I mean, that he really wants to build systems that keep children out of the police station, I think is really commendable. And what I would do is, if I was chief of police, if I was mayor of the city of Evanston, I would keep pushing for deflection. I would keep pushing for investment in social services, in human services. I would push for a system that really investigated and was discerning about that first contact that community members have with law enforcement, which is dispatch. You know, how is dispatch being utilized to deflect people from the system? And how can we build alternative systems like the one that Alderman Fleming is discussing and brainstorming about, that keep people, again, out of the system altogether, and that really meet people's needs, and that once we've identified what people's needs are, that we actually have the infrastructure to support those needs. I mean, that's what needs to happen. And I really do believe that the young people in our community, in our nation, have used the phrase defund the police in order to kind of shake us awake, and have caused a great dialogue about what it means to invest in community, what it means to invest in social services, and what it means to reimagine systems that, again, are in better relationship with the community. So those are my thoughts, Helen.
So Patrick, this message that the chief has of not wanting kids in the police station, how does that get to the police officer on the street? And do they seem to agree? I mean, how does top cop, but what about the guy on the street?
It's a great question. And one of the things that I really hope comes out of this is that, that we learn as a result of this national crisis, which, by the way, has been going on for 400 years, that many white people are just waking up to. But I really hope that another piece that comes out of this moment, this historic moment, is that we are also far more discerning about who we recruit and who we bring on to law enforcement, that we invest more in training, that we have systems of accountability, that the community has greater systems of accountability to hold officers who who breach that contract that they have with community, that they are held accountable for that breach. I think that what I would like to see too is that, and I've been in dialogue and in relationship with officers in our community for years, and often it is officers that say, we need restorative practices within the police department to dialogue with each other, and to impart lessons learned, like particularly officers that have been on the force for decades have lessons to impart to younger officers, and creating mechanisms within the police department that foster those lessons learned and those lessons being shared out I think is another tool that restorative practices could be used for in building a better police department.
I see another question relating to police officers being Evanston born. Does that make a difference? Which also leads to that inevitable question about whether police officers should live in and be a part of the community, or whether they're more comfortable living elsewhere, which I have heard from police officers as well, so that they're not engaged in, negative stuff with neighbors or family and so forth.
Yeah. I have seen officers, firefighters who live outside this community who serve us incredibly well, And they serve us incredibly well because they're in relationship with us. And so I don't think there's no silver bullet, and I shouldn't even use that phrase, but there's no quick fix in repairing harm between community and law enforcement. And I don't think there are any quick fixes in terms of developing deeper relationships between law enforcement and community. And so requiring law enforcement to live in Evanston, I don't think that's going to solve the inherent issues and the decades long, if not centuries long, issues that have persisted between community and law enforcement in our community and in our country. I do think that it really, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I really do believe it comes down to building relationships. And if leadership within the police department, and I believe it's there, leadership in the police department say, look, we value community policing and community being in dialogue and relationship with us. It shouldn't matter that a police officer lives in Zion. If that value is so embedded within the police department, and that's part of what we want to do in partnering with law enforcement, if that value is so embedded, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter that that law enforcement officer lives in Zion, in my opinion.
Are there any other burning issues? We are running down our time. Cheryl.
Is this a alternative to arrest program similar to the adjudication program that goes on in the Civic Center?
Yes, Cheryl, it's the juvenile adjudication.
Oh, okay.
So prior to this reform taking hold, and Alderman Wolin knows this, that our juvenile adjudication hearing division was for 0 to 92, right? Everybody was heard in the same forum at City Hall. We have pulled out children from that process, and it's a separate, it's not a separate division, but it's a separate hearing that is confidential, that is after school. It's actually held in the Aldermanic Library. I mean, and Cheryl has me thinking that, prior to this reform, if a 17-year-old got cited with, or I should say a 16-year-old got cited with a curfew violation, they had to miss school, go to a 1 o'clock adjudication hearing at City Hall on a Tuesday. I mean, we don't want children missing school to come to City Hall to have an adjudication hearing for a curfew violation. So that was one very simple shift we advocated for, and the city acquiesced. It's having them after school, making it also easier for parents to participate. Then also having it be confidential, not in city chambers, not with an adjudicator behind the dais, that it's in the Aldermanic Library, that the most critical staff member in that process is the city's clinician, that it really is, again, from the outset about building a relationship with that clinician and figuring out what the child can do to repair the harm that brought them to the adjudication process.
Well, and I think I told you that the very last question that I would ask you is, how can the league and how can individual people in our audience today support the Moran Center? I know that, like every website and every organization such as yours, there's a donate button on the first page. So
Yes, ma'am.
we know that. And I'm sure that you would welcome any kind of contributions. But in addition to that, how can we best support you?
Thank you for asking that question. So the League, look, I said at the outset, and I really meant it, I've been a member of the League since I was 18. And it's because the League in my community of Chappaqua, New York, yes, the home of Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, that is my hometown, was the touchstone. When the League came out and took a position on a political issue, they had studied it. They had looked at it 5 ways from Sunday, and the community trusted the League's research in knowing that the outcome of their study is what we as a community should collectively support. And so as the League continues to examine criminal justice, the criminal justice system, both pretrial, but also sentencing, I would urge the League, the local League, the League of Evanston, to be in dialogue with the Illinois State League and to advocate for reforms. I mentioned during some of my remarks that we have at the Moran Center been engaged in state advocacy in Springfield. One of the causes that we are very much in support of is State Senator Laura Fine's work to raise the age of the Juvenile Court Act from 18 to 21 for misdemeanors. I mean, I would implore the League to add that to one of its questions to examine and to study. Because again, if the League studies that issue and says, yes, the juvenile court system has the capacity to handle those cases and the expertise, I think that would go a long way with our legislature in adopting such a reform. And I can speak on many statewide advocacy issues. Another one, just to add into the hopper, the Moran Center drafted a bill to create a privilege between restorative justice participants, meaning that if I am an offender, am welcomed into a circle, that what I say in that circle will not be used against me in a court or tribunal proceeding. And that's really critical in a restorative justice practice, that people are afforded that form of privilege. We'd be the first state in the union to have that privilege codified into state statute, and that's House Bill 4295. And I urge the League to study that issue as well as part of an overall means by which we can really reform systems, not just our criminal justice system, but systems throughout our state. And the last thing that I would just touch on is we do need the League to be an advocate alongside us in advocating for investment in social services, mental health services within our own community. And lastly, we need the League to be a partner in being an anti-racist player and seeing how we can reform systems from an anti-racist lens. And so those are the ways that I see the League playing a really critical role in reimagining systems in our state and in our community. I think with that, we might have lost Jennifer because LinkedIn just told me that I am the host now of Zoom.
I think I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Great.
I'm back. I don't know what happened, that you just all disappeared for a moment, but
Great.
I found you.
Well, I was incredibly articulate and eloquent, Jennifer, while you were gone.
I don't think I missed too much. I'm sure you were. Oh, Patrick, I don't know how to thank you enough. I think we have all learned a lot. I am just so grateful for your spending this time with us and grateful for the work that you do. So I'd like to, with that, say thank you. Thank you to all of you who attended this afternoon. Stay safe, stay well, and vote.
Vote. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.